Hello. This will be the last lecture that we'll be having in our class. And in this lecture, we're going to cover the question of abortion. We're going to cover both the perspective of that abortion should be legal and the perspective of abortion should not be legal. So we're going to cover both of those perspectives. We're going to do the perspective of legalized abortion first. That's with Dr. Judith Jarvis Thompson. And her essay, and this is the last section of our textbook. And then after her essay, we will also discuss the essay by Don Marquis about why abortion is immoral. And so that would be the perspective that abortion should be illegal. Hopefully, you've been able to listen to all of the lectures so far in our course. If you haven't listened to the lectures, then you're probably not going to do as well on the tests, because there's a lot of things that are discussed here that aren't necessarily evident from just the reading. So this will be the last one. I'm going to try to make it a shorter lecture. We're going to cover stuff very quickly so that you'll have time this week to review. All of the content for the course is still up, and so I would encourage you as you're doing your preparation for the final exam, which I will also be making available shortly, to review the lectures as well as the text that you've been assigned. So first and foremost, we're going to start with Dr. Judith Jarvis Thompson, who was a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And she wrote this essay in the late 60s, and she wrote it at a time when abortion was prior to Roe versus Wade, so at a time that we're in again. Right, so at the time that she wrote this essay, abortion was legal in some states and illegal in other states. And prior to Roe versus Wade, there was a lot of activism on both sides that was focused on the laws in the individual states. So we're coming back to that now. And so Judith Jarvis Thompson is interesting. She starts her essay, and this is on page 369 of the textbook. So we're still in here. Taking her opponents, well, if she doesn't take them seriously, she at least acknowledges that maybe they have something to say. So immediately, she says, most opposition to abortion relies on the premise that the fetus is a human being, a person, from the moment of conception. And I think we should really clarify that. The operative word there is person, not human being. It's not as if we think that the fetus is something other than a human being. Scientifically, it's very clear that this is a human being at a very early stage of development. And the question is whether this human being at the early stage of development is some sort of entity that's endowed with moral significance or with rights, or needs to be treated in the same way that human beings walking around in the world are treated. We already have codified in law and in our moral tradition that we do treat different people, different kinds of human beings at different stages of development differently depending upon their stage of development, right? For instance, somebody who's maybe a human being at a 5-year-old stage of development, a parent can tell them, go to bed right now. And they have an obligation to obey that. Whereas if you were to have a human being at a 35-year-old stage of development, that's a moral command that it's really not permissible to give. You can't say, go to bed right now. And so we do have differences in what human beings at different stages of development are able to do and not to do. One very big example would be voting, right? So we do not allow 7-year-olds to vote because we don't believe that they have that right. Whereas a 26-year-old, we would, fight for their right to vote. So that's the question that's at stake with abortion, right? But she's not going to have that argument, right? She's not interested in having that argument because she thinks her case is very strong. And so already on page 570, she's saying that we're not going to have that argument. She said, I propose then that we grant that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception. So she's going to give them that ground, and then she's going to still show how they're wrong. She asks, how does the argument go from here? Something like this, I take it. Every person has a right to life, so the fetus has a right to life. No doubt the mother has a right to decide what shall happen in and to her body. Everyone would grant that. But surely a person's right to life is stronger and more stringent than another's right to decide what happens in and to her body, and so outweighs it. So the fetus may not be killed, and abortion may not be performed. And this is her encapsulation of the standard pro-life argument, which I think is fair. And remember, she's granting them their first premise, which is that the fetus is a person. And so this is a fair argument. And she's going to make an argument that is going to show the moral permissibility of abortion, even with this concession. So how does she do it? And she starts right away. And she does this by means of a thought experiment. So if you read philosophers, thought experiments are very common. If you went ahead and watched The Good Place on Netflix or some other platform, which was a sitcom on ABC a couple of years ago, it has a character in it named Chidi Enogonye, who is a moral philosopher. This is not the first time I've talked about this. And I think it's season 2, they do a lot of work in there with thought experiments. The thought experiment that they focus mostly on is the trolley problem, which is this thought experiment where if you had, a trolley going and there was a person on the track and you could flip the switch, but it might kill 3 people. Would you kill 3 people or 1 person if you could? This is the thought experiment. And what it's designed to do is to illustrate what our moral principles are, by changing what the normal consequences are. And this is a common thing for deontologists. So she's going to give a famous thought experiment in this essay. She also did a lot of work on the trolley problem. That's what she's more famous for, or what she's famous for other than this one. So she's going to be giving ultimately a deontological argument. And you find this among deontologists. They use these thought experiments to clarify principles, because what they want to do is they want to change the real world circumstances so that we're not doing utilitarianism. That's what it is. So this is her thought experiment. Imagine this, and this is on the bottom of page 170. Imagine this. You wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're sorry the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known, but still they did it. And the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him, but never mind. It's only for 9 months. By then he will have recovered from his ailment and can safely be unplugged from you. It is morally... that's the thought experiment. That's the end of the quotation. Then she asks, is it morally incumbent on you to accede to the situation? This is her question. No doubt it would be very nice of you if you did, a great kindness. But do you have to accede to it? What if it were not 9 months, but 9 years, or longer still? What if the director of the hospital says, tough luck, I agree, but now you've got to stay in bed with the violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life. But because of this, because remember this, but remember this, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens in and to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens in and to your body. So you cannot be unplugged from him. She gives the thought experiment to clarify the principle. She's a deontologist. So a time factor like 9 months really is not relevant. The question is whether you have bodily autonomy. And it's this, the answer is going to be the same whether it's for 9 months or 1 month or 9 years or a lifetime. The answer will be the same because she's trying to clarify the principle. But she does it by making it a little bit outrageous. And then she says, I imagine you would regard this as outrageous, which suggests that something really is wrong with that plausible sounding argument I mentioned a moment ago, right? And that's the pro-life argument, that the right to life kind of trumps the right to bodily autonomy. Right? So this is her argument. And she wants to clarify it further because what this is obviously is that it's an analogy for pregnancy. So the famous violinist is the fetus, and the person hooked up to the famous violinist against her will is the mother, right? And the first thing that you might say is, well, maybe this is a situation of rape. Maybe the analogy is to rape and not to, normal consensual sexuality. But she's not going to have that, right? Because she's trying to clarify these issues. Because what she's saying, and she's right about this when she characterizes the pro-life side, is for the pro-life side, she's saying that the pro-life argument she gave does not give it any kind of exception in the case of rape. That's the argument. It doesn't give an exception in the case of rape. And so what she's saying is that if the argument fails in the case of rape, then it's going to fail in every other case as well, right? And she gets to that later on, and we're trying to go quickly in today's lecture because you have review to do this week. But do please make sure that you read the whole thing, right? Do please make sure that you read the whole thing. She gives another analogy on page 576. And really, Thompson is at her best when she's giving these analogies. And remember, she was writing this in the late 60s, so the movie star that she mentions is Henry Fonda, who very well may be somebody you've never heard of. You can replace it with some, famous movie star of your choice, right? It says, if I am sick unto death, and the only thing that will save my life is the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow, then all the same I have no right to be given the touch of Henry Fonda's cool hand on my fevered brow. It would be frightfully nice of him to fly in from the West Coast and to provide it. It would be nice, though no doubt well meant, if my friends flew out to the West Coast and brought Henry Fonda back with them. But I have no right at all against anybody that he should do this for me. Or again, to return to the story that I told earlier, the fact that for continued life the violinist needs the continued use of your kidneys does not establish that he has a right to be given the continued use of your kidneys. She concludes, for nobody has any right to use your kidneys unless you give them this right. If you do not allow him to go on using your kidneys, so if you do allow him to go on using your kidneys, this is a kindness on your part and not something that he can claim from you as his due. Right? So I think this is a pretty good argument that she's saying, because one of the things that people will say about abortion is that the mother is the only person who can provide this care for the fetus. It's not like we can transplant the fetus into some other situation to save their life. The mother is uniquely the person who can do this. And so she's addressing that argument here. She addresses it with the famous violinist, and then she addresses it again with this thought experiment about Henry Fonda, that the mother is the one who can do it. And I think that this works pretty well. It works pretty well, but I think part of the reason that it works pretty well is because we don't think of this as an actual possibility. right? We don't think of it as an actual possibility that Henry Fonda could be the one who, and the only one who could cure a life-threatening illness. But if we change the thought experiment a little bit, then it might not work as well. So the person who was president when she wrote this essay was Richard Nixon. So we'll use Richard Nixon. So what if we change the thought experiment so that the person who's sick and feverish and going to die is not Judith Jarvis Thompson, but Richard Nixon? Then we could ask the question, right? Would Henry Fonda have to come and cure Richard Nixon? And I think in this case, our moral intuition is different. That we would say, yes, Henry Fonda does have to come to cure Richard Nixon. And I think that we would send, the Secret Service or the FBI or the military to go get Henry Fonda and to bring him, because he would be the person who was uniquely qualified, right, to be able to work the cure for Richard Nixon. Right? And if that's true, then we have to then ask the question, well, is Richard Nixon's life worth any more or any less than Judith Jarvis Thompson? And then we would have to say no. So I'm not sure this one works as well. But that's not the only thing that she's got. She's got another thought experiment that's closer to the end of this essay. Where she talks about a burglar. And this is on page 580. 580. She talks about the burglar. She says, if the room is stuffy, and I therefore open a window to air it, and a burglar climbs in, it would be absurd to say, now he can stay. She's given him a right to the use of her house, for she is partially responsible for his presence, and having voluntarily done what enabled him to get in full knowledge that there are such things as burglars, and that burglars burgle. So what is this thought experiment about? Well, this thought experiment is about failed contraception, right? She just wanted some air, so she opened a window. But it's not right that a burglar should come in. To make matters more clear, she gets into a little bit more intense thought experiment a little bit further down this same page. She says, it remains equally absurd if we imagine it is not a burglar who climbs in, but an innocent person who blunders or falls in. Again, suppose it were like this. People seeds drift about in the air like pollen, and if you open your windows, one may drift in and take root in your carpets or upholstery. You don't want children, so you fix up your windows with fine mesh screens, and the very best you can buy. As can happen, however, on very, very rare occasions does happen, one of the screens is defective and a seed drifts in and takes root. Does the person plant who grew now develops have a right to the use of your house? Surely not. Despite the fact that you voluntarily opened your windows, knowingly kept carpets and upholstered furniture, and you knew that screens were sometimes defective. Someone may argue that you are responsible for its rooting, that it does have a right to your house, because after all, you could have lived out your life with bare floors and furniture, or with sealed windows and doors, but this won't do. For by the same token, anyone can avoid a pregnancy due to rape by having a hysterectomy, or anyway, by never leaving the home without a reliable army. And so what is she doing here? Well, she's showing through the use of thought experiment and analogy that this distinction that we have between rape and failed contraception is not a logical distinction, right? It's not a logical distinction. Because in both cases, the pregnancy is not consented to. In both cases, the pregnancy is not consented to. the last thing that she does in this essay, and I know that we're going through this very quickly, but the last thing that she does is she talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan. And the reason she does this is that she's trying to talk really to the person who are on the other side of this question from her, which are largely religious people. The pro-life movement in the 60s was largely composed of religious people, mostly Catholics at that time, and it's largely composed of religious people now. And so she's using this argument that's based on this parable that Jesus had in the scriptures, where she talks about the Good Samaritan helping the person who was beaten up and laying on the side of the road. And she's saying there that, perhaps the choice isn't between what the Good Samaritan did, which was to care for the person beat up on the side of the road and bring him to an inn and pay for his care and treatment, basically, and doing nothing, which is what some of the other people in the parable did. But perhaps instead of being a good Samaritan, we can be a minimally decent Samaritan, that we can call an ambulance or ask somebody else to help. And so there's this intuition that she's appealing to, that we could be minimally decent, but we don't have to be good. We don't have to go all the way. So we don't have to be Henry Fonda who shows up, right? That would be nice of him, but he's still minimally decent even if he doesn't come, right? Maybe he can send you a get well card. And right away in the next essay that we're going to read, Don Marquis, who was a professor at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, is going to kind of disrupt what Judith Jarvis Thompson is doing here. Because Marquis's essay, and you'll see how this is connected, Marquis's essay, which is called Why Abortion is Immoral, is focused on a different question, right? And if we look at 590, he talks about that almost immediately. He's talking about the general positions on abortion and how they are wrong. Let's read a little bit of this. This is on 590. He says, if the generalizations a partisan in the abortion dispute adopts or derived from reasons why ending life of a human being is wrong, then there could not be exceptions to that generalization unless some special case obtains, which there are even more powerful and countervailing reasons. Such generalizations would not be merely accidental generalizations. They would point to or be based upon the essence of the wrongness of killing. That it is what it is that makes killing wrong. All of this suggests that a necessary condition of resolving the abortion controversy is a more theoretical account of the wrongness of killing. After all, if we merely believe but do not understand why killing an adult human being, such as ourselves, is wrong, how could we conceivably show that abortion is either immoral or permissible? So he's shifting the question, right? He's shifting the question to the question of why killing is wrong, which has an important effect for Judith Jarvis Thompson. So let's start with the last thing she talks about, which is the Good Samaritan. It's interesting that she brings this up. I don't know if she was a believer herself. I suspect not. But the classical Christian interpretation of this parable is, and when you read the parables of Christ, or you study the parables of Christ, one of the things that you realize quickly is that for every parable that he has, you as the reader, or you as the hearer of the parable, are in it somewhere. One of the characters in the parable is supposed to correspond to you. And I think Thompson knows this, right? But what she does in the parable of the Good Samaritan is that she assumes that the character in the parable that corresponds to us is the Samaritan, right? Which is why she says, well, we don't have to be good Samaritans. We can be minimally decent Samaritans. But the Christian tradition has interpreted this parable differently. The person that we as the hearer are in the parable is the person in the ditch, the one who's been robbed and beaten and is lying there half dead. That's the person we are. The Good Samaritan in the parable is Christ, right? And when at the end of the parable, when Christ says, "Go thou and do likewise," what he's saying is, "Go be like me," because he's the one who's the Good Samaritan in the parable. And Thompson misses this, and Marquis doesn't miss it. I mean, Marquis isn't responding to her directly, but he doesn't miss this. So what this means then is if we look at the other thought experiments that she gives, the people seeds, the burglar, the famous violinist, is that if we look at them differently, we can draw different conclusions from them that we might otherwise not find if we change the person in the thought experiment who we are. So, for instance, if you're not the homeowner with the window screens trying to keep out the people seeds, but are instead the people seed who drifts in and takes root, then that changes the thought experiment, right? If we are not the person who's kidnapped and hooked up to a famous violinist against our will, but instead are a famous violinist who is also kidnapped and hooked up to some other person against his own will, and if he is disconnected, he will die, that changes the thought experiment. And this is the first thing that Marquis does, because he's asking the question, why is killing wrong? And he's starting that asking by asking the question, well, why would it be wrong to kill us? So he flips it around on her right away. So let's look at some of what he says. He goes through some bad answers, and then at the bottom of 590 says, a more obvious answer is better. What primarily makes killing wrong is neither the effects on the murderer, nor its effect on the victim's friends, but its effect on the victim. The loss of one's own life is the greatest losses that one can suffer. The loss of one's life deprives one of all experiences, activities, projects, and enjoyments that would otherwise have constituted one's future. Therefore, killing someone is wrong primarily because killing inflicts one of the greatest possible losses on the victim. To describe this as the loss of life can be misleading, however. The change in my biological state does not, by itself, make killing me wrong. The effect of the loss of my biological life is the loss to me of all those activities, projects, experiences, and enjoyments which would otherwise have constituted my personal future. These activities, projects, experiences, and enjoyments are either valuable for their own sake or are a means to something else that is valuable for its own sake. Some parts of my future are not valued by me now, but will come to be valued by me as I grow older and as my values and capacities change. When I am killed, I am deprived both of what I now value, which would have been a part of my future personal life, but also what I would come to value. Therefore, when I die, I am deprived of all of the value of my future. Inflicting this loss on me is ultimately what makes killing me wrong. This being the case, it would seem that what makes killing any adult human being prima facie seriously wrong is the loss of his or her own future. So we see, what is he talking about? He's talking about the consequences of the action. The consequences of the action of killing an adult human being is the loss of his or her future. This is a utilitarian argument, right? It's based upon the effects of the action in the real world. The effects of the action of killing is the loss of the future of the person killed. So we can think of like any wrong that you might suffer, even a minor one, say like the loss of $100, right? Somebody steals $100 from you. This is a wrong. You've been wronged. You've suffered. You've suffered the use and enjoyment of that $100, which could be used to, perhaps fill up your gas tank, or take some significant person in your life out to a nice meal at a restaurant, and it's lost to you now, and this is a harm that's been done to you. But when you kill somebody, it's not just that you've done something like taken $100 from them. You've taken all of their money from them. You've taken all of their belongings from them, and you haven't taken them for yourself, right? It's not about the perpetrator, what the perpetrator has gained. It's what the victim has lost. So the victim has lost their home, their family, their money, their car, their job. And it's not just these things that they have that they've lost. It's everything that they've lost going into the future. So every dollar they've ever earned or would earn after that, you've stolen. All of the friendships that they were going to make later, you've stolen. All of, if they were, going to get married and have children and grandchildren, you've stolen the enjoyment of all of that from them. And this is what makes killing wrong. And Marquis is going to go on to say that this intuition, that the wrongness of killing is about the consequences, even fits with our moral intuitions, right? So we have this moral intuition that, say, killing a 3-year-old is wrong, even more wrong than, say, killing a 95-year-old, right? But and why? Because that 95-year-old has less of a future left than that 3-year-old has, right? The 3-year-old has much more potential future. The loss is bigger than the 95-year-old. And this fits with our intuition about doing things like, pulling the plug on the terminally ill people who really don't have a future like ours to lose. And we see this as less morally problematic. It'd be less morally problematic to, unplug somebody who is in a persistent vegetative state, who has nothing like a future like ours, than it would be to kill a 22-year-old in the prime of their life, because they have much more of a future like ours. And this is the argument that he gives. And one of the interesting things about this argument is that first he applies it to adults, and then he's going to apply it to children, and then he's going to apply it to fetuses. What's fascinating is that it doesn't have anything to do with the personhood of the fetus, whether or not the fetus is a person or not. What we know is that the fetus, given its development, birth, and growth, if it's destroyed, is deprived of a future like ours. Whether it has any consciousness now or any moral status now, the future of the fetus is a future like ours, not a future like somebody else's, even if the fetus isn't a person now. And so what happens then is that the moral reason that killing an adult human being is wrong becomes the same reason that killing a fetus is wrong, even if the fetus is not a person. This is a utilitarian argument, because the effect in the world of killing a fetus is the same as the effect of killing a person who was murdered or killed after they were born. The effect is the same. Therefore, the moral status is the same. This is an interesting argument. Please do read the whole thing. We have not talked about it in a ton of detail. There is more detail in there. So these are two good arguments about abortion, and one of the reasons why I like to teach these two arguments is because they are kind of the opposite of what we expect. So what we expect when we're talking about the abortion debate is that the pro-life side is going to give an argument about the sanctity of life, and it's going to be coming from a deontological perspective. And they're going to say things like, you cannot kill the fetus regardless of the consequences. That this is a strict moral law, that you have a moral duty to care for the fetus based upon the dignity of the fetus. It's a deontological type of an argument. And then on the other side, on the pro-choice side, Normally we'll get arguments about how women with unplanned pregnancies or women who were raped are having to bear these consequences in their lives, right, for things that they didn't choose. And so we end up getting a utilitarian argument. So normally the pro-life side is a deontological argument, and the pro-choice side is a utilitarian argument. And Judith Jarvis Thompson and Don Marquis do us the favor of showing that you can have a deontological argument, and it's a very strong argument, that is the pro-choice argument, right? And you will hear it. You'll hear the arguments again and again about bodily autonomy, 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 autonomy. These are always deontological arguments. But Don Marquis gives us a utilitarian argument for the pro-life side, that killing a fetus is wrong regardless of whether it's a human being, because it has the same consequence as killing an adult. And if we do the moral calculus, right, if we show what the woman has to lose versus what the fetus has to lose, the fetus is always losing more, right? The only time that you have a question is when the mother's life is in danger. And so when we read Marquis, we realize, oh, that's a different case, right? That's a different case because the loss is the same to both. Whereas in cases where the mother's life is not in danger, the loss is not the same to both. The mother is always seen as having her potential loss as limited, inherently limited, whereas the fetus's loss is always inherently unlimited. And so that's why I like to teach these two arguments. Hopefully, these arguments will help you to clarify your own thinking, because in Michigan, there is currently a petition drive to put this question on the ballot. I expect that they will gather enough signatures. I would be shocked if they didn't. And we will all be voting on this question in November, whether or not abortion should be, and I think the ballot question is whether it should be legal in Michigan to have a right to an abortion, right? We're not going to be, I don't think we're going to be voting on the other question. I don't think there's anybody trying to put a petition on the ballot to make abortion illegal. That is actually the current state of the Michigan law. However, the Supreme Court of Michigan has enjoined that law currently from going into effect so that they can hear more arguments about it. So this is it for lectures on our ethics class. I do hope that you have enjoyed the class. There will be some more announcements this week. I will put the final exam up today, which is the 4th of July, and that may be up before this video is up. Sometimes the videos take a long time to upload. So that is it. There will also be some other announcements. We're gonna have a course evaluation link that'll be posted up at some point also this week, and also expect your midterm grades to show up this week. I do want to thank you. It has been an interesting experience teaching online. I have come to the conclusion that this material is probably better taught in person, but we work with the circumstances that we find ourselves in. So I look forward, hopefully, to seeing you on campus in the fall at some point. I don't think you're going to be taking my classes, but perhaps I will be seeing you around.